Spiritual abuse sucks. And I am so tired of it. Guys, I'm tired of it. But what about you? Are you tired of seeing one church scandal after another? Are you tired of seeing church leaders abusing their power all over, not just the United States, but it seems like all over the Western world? Are you ready to see the church restore its reputation and undo the damage that's been done to all of our reputations over recent years? If so, if that's you, then you don't want to miss this episode. Because in this episode of the Church Disrupted podcast, I'll be sharing how you, how me, and how Christians everywhere can take a stand against spiritual abuse and how we can take practical steps, extremely practical steps to creating safe churches in your community, in my community, and in the communities where we all live, work, and play. So hey, if you've ever asked this question, how can we stop spiritual abuse? Then this episode is for you. So let's get into it. So welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about something, guys, that has the potential to absolutely reshape how we do church in a way that reflects Jesus, in a way that rebuilds trust where it's been broken, and in a way that most importantly is safe for people in our churches. All right, so here's the big idea for today's episode. What if there was a practical and actionable way to stop the cycle of abuse and church scandals in our churches? What if there was a practical and actionable way to protect the people in our pews? And what if we can move past the headlines and make sure that our churches are safe, they're transparent, and they're above reproach? And that's exactly what the Safe Church Pledge is all about. And to be honest, I can't wait to break it down with you today. So whether you're a pastor who's leading a church, or you're a lay leader in a church, or you're just someone who loves your church or the church and wants to see it thrive, this episode is for you. Let's dive right into it, okay? So let's start this way and just be completely transparent about where we're at together, because that's what we want to do on this show. If you've been paying attention to the news over the past few years, you know that the church, the Christian church, has a problem, and it's a big problem. Scandals, financial abuse, moral failures, spiritual manipulation. They have rocked not only local churches, but also denominations and Christian organizations alike. And guys, listen, I'm not here to point fingers or to just sensationalize the failures of other churches and ministries, but we have to talk about this stuff. Because every time one of these stories breaks, it doesn't just hurt the people who are directly involved. It damages the credibility of the gospel itself. It damages the credibility of churches and Christians everywhere. And the reality is that people are walking away from the church. And who can blame them for walking away from churches when trust has been shattered the way that it has been? But here's the thing, it doesn't have to be this way. Maybe more accurately, it doesn't have to stay this way. Because the reality is that church scandals don't just happen out of nowhere. They happen because there are gaps. There are gaps in accountability, gaps in transparency, gaps in protective systems, gaps in the way that we respond. And guys, if we are serious about following Jesus and leading his church in a safe and healthy way, we have to close those gaps. And that's where the Safe Church Pledge comes in. That's what we're talking about throughout today's episode. SAI is introducing officially. The Spiritual Abuse Institute is officially introducing the Safe Church Pledge, and we believe wholeheartedly that this is going to be a game changer for the church everywhere all across the globe. And I'm pumped to share it with you. We'd love to get your feedback as well. And most of all, we want your help to actually roll this out and begin making a difference in churches, because I think my favorite part of this is that this is going to give every Christian who hears about it a voice in making a safe church, a healthy church, a transparent church, a real thing. It's going to give you your voice back, and it's going to give you not only your voice, but it's going to put accountability back in all of our hands. All right, so let's talk about what this is. You may be saying, Jeff, I haven't heard about this. What is the Safe Church Pledge? And I am so glad that you asked. Here's what the Safe Church Pledge is. The Safe Church Pledge is a practical 16-step commitment that churches and ministries can make, and it prioritizes a few things, okay? So I want you to think about this. The Safe Church Pledge is built around prioritizing three kind of primary buckets, three primary commitments and categories. And here's what they are. When a church signs a Safe Church Pledge, they're prioritizing transparency, they're prioritizing accountability, and they're prioritizing protective measures and protective systems, okay? So I want you to think about the Safe Church Pledge as a roadmap to creating environments where abuse has nowhere to hide, where trust can grow, and most importantly, where the gospel can shine. Now, you may be saying, Jeff, how can anything, any system, any pledge, any assessment, how can anything guarantee that there's no abuse, that there's no spiritual abuse? And the truth is, there is nothing that can guarantee that. But what we can do is we can use resources like the Safe Church Pledge to make abuse hard to hide, hard to get away with, and we can build, again, those environments where trust can grow and the gospel can shine. So that's what we're trying to do with the Safe Church Pledge. And again, the Safe Church Pledge is built around those three main pillars: transparency, accountability, and protective measures. So let's talk about why we built the pledge around these measures. And more importantly, why is it that we believe that safe churches are those three things? Because I believe that wholeheartedly. I believe that safe churches, if you said, Jeff, what is a safe church? The best way I know how to describe them is I would say safe churches are three things. Safe churches are accountable, they're transparent, and they protect people. Okay, so let's start with transparency. Why transparency? Why are safe churches transparent? Well, transparency in this category, it's about things like financial integrity, conflict of interest and how we deal with that. It's about public disclosures that allow people in our churches and our communities to know that they can trust churches, and it ensures that nothing is hidden in the dark. Transparent just means see-through, and safe churches are see-through. They say we have nothing to hide, and we want to provide information to the people in our pews and the people in our community to let them know we are an open book, okay? What about accountability? How is accountability different from transparency? Well, the accountability pillar, it covers things like governance structures. It covers things like making sure that there's independent oversight and independent governance on like elder boards and, presbyteries and stuff like that. But it also makes sure that there are policies that are put in place and that there's plans put in place to deal with any allegations of misconduct, okay? Whether that's SA, whether that's criminal misconduct, whether it's just spiritual abuse, whether it's abuse of power, any allegations of misconduct, it puts plans in place in the accountability pillar in a way that's fair, honest, and biblical, and protects everybody involved. And we're going to talk about this later. This is about protecting victims, absolutely, but these things are also about protecting churches and leaders from false allegations. Now, while that's rare, and the majority of allegations that are made are true, we all know that there are false allegations that come out sometimes. So this protects everybody involved throughout the process. That's what accountability is about, okay? When something happens, are there plans, processes in place, and is it public enough where everybody knows what's going to happen, okay? Accountability is a lot of deciding in advance. This is the best way I know how to describe it. It's when churches decide in advance how we are going to respond in a God-honoring and people-honoring way to allegations of any sort of misconduct. And because it's accountability, we're going to let people know what to expect so they can hold us to that commitment. Okay. And then the last pillar is protective measures. Now, some of these are systems, some of these are a little bit different, but the best way I know how to describe them is protective measures. And this pillar, it includes things like making sure that our staffs and volunteers are trauma informed, that they have trauma informed training. Now, again, that doesn't mean we're not going to make mistakes, but it means that people are equipped in such a way that we're not re-traumatizing people with poor responses to abuse, poor responses to people saying that they've been hurt. It includes things like whistleblower protections, making sure that people can tell what they've seen, they can tell their stories without retaliation, that they're protected. And it includes really practical systems like safeguards for children, but not just children, for teenagers, because in a lot of churches, the safeguards for teenagers are not where they need to be. And I say that, guys, as a longtime youth pastor who looks back and says we needed to be a lot better across the board of the things that we did for students who got older, right? But not just that. These are protective safeguards and policies for children, for teens, and adults. And we're going to talk about that because this allows us to, in advance again, try to set up safeguards, boundaries, guardrails that protect not only children, not only minors, but they protect adults from things like adult clergy SA, okay? But here's the kicker. This pledge, the Safe Church Pledge, is not just a set of rules to follow. It's much bigger than that. The Safe Church Pledge is a framework that helps churches operate above reproach and show the world what integrity looks like in action. And that's what the Bible calls church leaders and churches to be above reproach. Now, above reproach doesn't mean no allegations can come. It just means that when allegations come, we can put everything out on the table and say, we are going to allow that reproach, and that reproach is not going to stand. And if it does, we are going to fix it. We are above reproach. And again, it's been a long time since the church has been known as what integrity looks like in action. And there are recent statistics. I don't have the study in front of me for this episode, but there are recent statistics that show, surveys that show trust in clergy is at an all-time low because we've let too many of these scandals happen, too much abuse grow right under our noses, okay? So this is a so much more than a set of rules to follow. It's a framework that lets us show the world what integrity looks like in action. And here's the best part. The Safe Church Pledge doesn't leave churches to figure this stuff out on their own. Okay, if you're a pastor listening, you're an elder, a lay leader, a volunteer, you may be thinking, when we talk about some of this, Jeff, like 16 commitments they're not doing now, all of these policies and these things, that's a lot of work for a church to do. And we agree. It is a lot of work for a church to do. But we want churches to know they're not alone. We come alongside churches, SAI, the Spiritual Abuse Institute. When churches sign this pledge, we come alongside of them, providing them with resources, with training, not only for the 18 months that we give them to put these things in place, because we don't expect churches to put these commitments and systems into place overnight. We give them 18 months to do that, okay? We walk through the entire process with them. We have webinars, online trainings, online courses. We allow them to set up one-on-one phone calls and Q&A sessions when they need it with their team. We provide templates and documents and instructions because we want to help them be successful. But not only that, when the church is signed, they get 18 months of all those things, but we also walk through with them and continue to offer for a lifetime. For as long as we are doing this with SAI, as long as we're doing this work, we're going to keep providing churches that are on the pledge list and are current. We're going to continue to provide them with training at no additional cost. So they could be 10 years down the road, and we're still going to be updating these things, providing new resources. Because if this is you, if you're a church leader and you're signing this church, or if you're this pledge, or if you're a parishioner and you say, I want my church to sign this pledge, we want you to know churches are not on their own with this. We want to help them be successful. We want to help this process be as easy and seamless as possible, okay? Because the more churches that take this pledge and put these practices, these Safe Church commitments into practice, the better we're all going to be. So In today's episode, here's what I want to do. I want to share each of the 16 church commitments with you. I want to talk about why they matter, and I want to spend some time responding to the most common pushback that we hear from people about them. And part of the reason why I want to do that is because I want to answer the common pushback, but I also want to help you begin to think a little more deeply about these pledge elements, because if you ask your pastor or church leader to sign this, they may have questions. They may have feedback, they may have pushback, and guys, that is not a bad thing. When we created this pledge in conjunction with pastors. Not only was I a pastor for 17 years, but we created this in conjunction with pastors. We got feedback from pastors, and honestly, their feedback helped to make this better, because the goal is not to have a pledge that people are scared to sign or that feels like it's too heavy for people to take action with. We want this to be something that churches can feel comfortable is a good thing for them. It's a good thing for their parishioners. It's a good thing for their bottom line, and it's a good thing for everybody. So we're going to talk about, again, what each of the 16 commitments are, what some of those common pushbacks and questions that we get are, so that you are equipped, whether you are on staff, a volunteer, or you just want to see safe churches around you. We want to help equip you to have conversations with church leaders about the Safe Church Pledge. All right, so let's jump into it and start breaking down the 16 safe church practices together. And what we're going to do this by taking one of the major safe church pillars at a time. So let's start with transparency and the safe church practices and commitments that fall under a church being transparent. So when a church commits to be transparent, the first thing that they're committing to on the pledge is financial transparency. And with each of these, as you're going to see, we have a minimum requirement and we have a best practice, because with the Safe Church Pledge, we're going to put lists together, public lists on our website that says, these are Safe Church pledged churches, okay? These are churches that have not only committed to do these things, but we've walked with them and we can say we've held them accountable. When they went on the list, they were doing these things. And then the cool part is you can now hold them accountable to say, are they still doing these things 2, 3, 4 years later, okay? Because we're putting all that information out there. Now, the minimum requirements is to make it easy for churches to make significant safety commitments, okay? The best practices, we're going to be completely candid here. The best practices are where we would like to see churches go, okay? Those are going the extra mile. It's taking the extra step. And my hope is that every church that signs the Safe Church Pledge will one day be able to say, we've committed and implemented. We committed to and implemented all of the best practices across the board with this pledge. But because we know that may be too much for churches, we want to help them to take steps, okay? So there's going to be 2 lists when we start looking at this. There's going to be 2 Safe Church lists. There's going to be a silver list. The silver list is going to be churches that have committed to at least the minimum requirement with all 16 safe church practices. But then there's also going to be a gold list. And the gold list is going to be churches that have committed to go above and beyond. They've committed to the best practice in all of these commitments. And when you look at these lists, a church being on the silver list versus the gold list doesn't mean that one church is better than the other or that one church is safer than the other. What it means is simply, if you're looking at 2 churches there, the church on the gold list has went the extra mile in making that commitment. They've done a little bit extra to show that they care about safety, that they want to be as accountable as possible, as transparent as possible, and of course, they want to be as protective as possible. So let's start again in accountability, the accountability pillar. The first thing that churches are committing to in the Safe Church Pledge is financial transparency, and here's the minimum requirement. We ask them to provide detailed disclosures of finances to SAI, okay? And those aren't public, but we look over them, and here's what they include. They include things like the full budget for the current year and the actual income and expenses from the previous year. That budget style financial disclosure, it needs to include any compensation to board members, okay? So any board members or governing officers that are getting paid. It's going to include the salary and other income. So not just the salary, but the housing allowance for any employees that are making $100,000 or more. Okay. And when you say, Jeff, where did you get all those things? We got those things literally from the 990 form that all secular nonprofits are required to fill out. Secular nonprofits by law are required to give this information. Okay. And again, we always believe that churches should be more accountable and more transparent than the world. Okay, so what we're asking is that a church would submit those financial disclosures, not just the budget, but the actual expenses. We'll take a look at both of those, make sure that they have all of the information, that they're detailed enough. If they're not detailed enough, we're going to ask for a little more information, making sure that they have the major components that every secular nonprofit would have to fill out in a 990. And again, with the minimum requirement, they don't have to publish those publicly. Okay. They don't have to publish those publicly, but what they do have to do is they have to get that to SAI and they have to make that available to their congregation. Okay. So while it doesn't have to be public and on their website, SAI needs to see it to review it, and their congregation needs to be able to see it and review it. Okay. Now here's the best practice though. The best practice goes farther. The best practice for financial transparency is a public financial disclosure that is at minimum as detailed as a 990 form. So it's going to take this a little further. It's going to give the salary and other income like housing allowances of not just the current board members, not just everybody who makes over $100,000, but it's also going to include the top 5 salaries and other income for the top 5 paid employees. Okay. And if a church doesn't have many employees, it might just be anybody who makes over 100,000. But if a church is big and they have a big staff, that's going to be disclosing their top 5 salaries. Okay. And again, that's a public disclosure. So the best practice is we put that on our website, or we just fill out a 990 form with the government, because churches can do that. And when we fill out that 990 form, it'll go on GuideStar and everywhere else. And we give it to our congregation as well. But the best practice is to put all that information out there, just like a secular nonprofit would, and allow the public to see it so that potential members and potential donors could know how the church is handling their finances. Now, what's some of the common pushback that we get with this item, with the financial transparency commitment? Okay. Probably the biggest pushback that we get, I hear this all the time. Hey, Jeff, salaries are personal information. Okay. And I get that. A lot of us, we grew up with parents who said we don't talk about finances. Okay. So salaries can feel like very personal information. Here's the response that I tend to give to pastors. And again, in a conversation face-to-face, pastors, I can give you a lot more information. I would love to sit down with you, to talk with you, reach out, use the contact form on spiritualabuse.institute, our website, if you want to have a face-to-face conversation about this. But my general responses include things like this. All secular nonprofits and many secular for-profit institutions, they already share the salaries of their top earners. Okay, so this is a common practice for accountability and transparency in the world. And just like I said before, I remind pastors, the church should always be, and I do mean always be, more transparent than the world. Beyond that, while salaries can feel really personal, salaries aren't really personal information when they're paid by good faith donations. Okay, donors at minimum, the people who are giving to your church at minimum, have as much of a right or more of a right to understand how their donations are being used regarding salaries in your church or ministry as the U.S. public does with politicians. And we know what people in Congress are being paid for their job. We know what senators are being paid for their job. Over the years, it has become standard practice in many cases for politicians to release their tax disclosures and tax documents. We want transparency with government officials. Well, look, people who are donating to provide your salary, I think they deserve a lot more of that information. So not only do donors deserve it, but we want to be more transparent than the world. And the world doesn't say salaries are too personal. Okay, you can look up any secular nonprofit and you can see the CEO's salary and other income. Okay, why? Because donors need transparency. And listen, I understand this is uncomfortable, but while I understand it's uncomfortable, I always encourage pastors as well. It's doable and it accomplishes a lot more good than bad. Okay. Another piece of pushback that we get, Jeff, if we publish detailed financial information, critics of our church could use this to hurt the church or try to take us down. Now, again, my response, I remind them that all secular nonprofits are required to do this, and rarely does anyone try to take them down. Even more rarely does someone successfully take them down, because there's something about publicly disclosing things like finances that really disarms critics. You may have an issue with that, but we provided that publicly. We're not hiding that. We can tell you why we did that, right? And again, the church should always strive. I believe this to my core. The church should always strive to be more transparent and more above reproach than the world. If the money's spent justifiably, it's rarely going to result in a person being critical or people being critical and criticizing those churches for their lack of disclosure. Usually, when people are going to be critical in a way that hurts your church, because people are always going to be critical, okay? But if they're going to be critical in a way that hurts your church, it's only going to be if something's unclear, which is why we want it to be detailed, or if something doesn't look right. Something looks lavish, something looks crazy. And again, that's why we want to work pastors with churches to say, hey, we want to help make sure you have the right detail for this. And this is the cool part. The more churches that sign the Safe Church Pledge and commit to financial transparency, we're seeing and reviewing all those documents, it helps us to establish statistical norms so that we can say, what are the normal ranges for churches that commit to safety in things like their salaries, things like what they spend on programming, what they spend on this, that, and the other, what they spend on the building, what they spend on, team members and employment and all of that. Okay. So that's some of the biggest pushback that we get. That's how we begin to have those conversations though. And at the end of the day, while it's uncomfortable, these are steps the church needs to take to be more transparent, or at least as transparent as secular organizations. Okay. To be above reproach, like the Bible's called us to be. Now, the second commitment under the transparency bucket is to create a conflict of interest policy, okay? A conflict of interest policy and disclosures for any board members and key employees. So any board members, key employees that are making big decisions, that are calling the shots, that are really kind of making decisions of day-to-day operations on their own or in small groups, they're going to need to disclose a signed conflict of interest policy. So we're going to have that policy out there, and we're going to say, all key employees and board members have signed it. All right, now here's the minimum requirement with that. A conflict of interest policy is in place, okay? So it's written, it's in place, it's been officially adopted by the governing board of the church or the ministry, and as a minimum requirement, it's submitted to SAI for review, and it's available to the congregation and church members upon request, okay? Again, why did they submit it to us for review? We want to look and make sure that all the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, that this is a conflict of interest policy that takes care of all the big questions people would have. And when we're thinking about conflict of interest policy, we're basically looking ahead, we're defining what a conflict of interest would be, and making sure that we don't have elder boards and staff members who are making decisions when there's a conflict that may make them make a decision differently that's because it's better for them than what would be better for the church. It also outlines what to do when a conflict of interest arises, how you disclose that, and when you remove yourself from making decisions, from voting for things like that. Again, every secular nonprofit should have this. Our nonprofit has this. All board members have to sign it. So you're just making sure that you have one as a church. A lot of churches don't have one. It's simple to make one. Make sure it gets voted on, it's put in place, and you make it available where your congregation can see it if they want to go see it, and we review it so that everybody knows, hey, how do we handle conflicts of interest around here and make sure that decisions are being made in the best interest of the church as a whole. Now, the best practice goes a little farther, like it always does. For the best practice, the conflict of interest policy is in place. It's officially adopted by the governing body. Everything we just talked about, it's submitted to us, and it's made publicly available, not just to the congregation, but those public disclosures are made available on the church's website, and they disclose and include any current conflicts of interest by governing body members and key staff members. So if there's a current conflict of interest, so it may be something like, hey, this person, this staff member's family member is also the insurance agent that's providing the insurance policy for the church. So in any discussions about insurance, and then you would list other related discussions that may affect insurance, this person will abstain from those conversations and from those votes. By making that public, that no one is going to criticize you for that. They're going to say, oh, that makes sense. That person was the best person to maybe provide that insurance policy. It was the best deal. There's a reason outlined for that. Again, the conflict of interest policy would make sure that there's reasons outlined for that. But this person's not going to be a part of those, and they're just letting us know that's a current conflict of interest, something they step back from. Okay. Now, what's the common pushback with conflict of interest policies? One of the most common pieces of pushback that I hear is I'll have pastors or church leaders, they'll say, Jeff, the Bible doesn't say anything about conflict of interest policies. So why should we have these policies and these documents just because some man tells us to? And the truth is, yes, the Bible doesn't speak comprehensively about everything in our modern culture. There's a lot it doesn't speak about, but it does speak about principles, okay? Principles like church leaders being above reproach and having a good reputation with outsiders. And those just aren't just principles, they're requirements for elders and overseers. But it also teaches us things like not to treat people differently because the amount of money that they have or what they can do for us and the church. By publishing a conflict of interest policy, here's what we do. As a church, we become transparent and above reproach in this area. We live out those biblical principles. It also shows our commitment that we want to make the right decisions. We want to make decisions that are in the best interest of the church body and our community. And guys, transparency in areas like this are almost always going to help the church's reputation with outsiders. I just don't see hardly any cases of being transparent about something like a conflict of interest policy and it hurting our reputation with outsiders. Because when people look, they go, wow, that's an extra step they took. They even put that on their website to make sure that people know that they're making good decisions. Now, another piece of pushback, sometimes we'll hear people say, Jeff, we already have a policy in place. So why should we make it publicly available? We got that in place. We're totally good with it, but why take the extra step of making it public? Well, again, when we make documents public like this, it shows our commitment to transparency, to being above reproach. It also allows parishioners to hold their leaders accountable for the commitments that they made. All right. You can have a policy, but if people don't know about that policy, there's a lot of policies in filing cabinets that aren't being followed by people in organizations. And this allows accountability just to make sure those are being followed. There are a lot of upsides to publishing something as simple as your conflict of interest policy and making sure those are signed, letting people know that. There's not much in the way of downsides for this practice, though. It's a lot less uncomfortable than something like the financial transparency. Plus, again, secular nonprofits are required to have conflict of interest policies for a lot of things, like to receive grants and certain funding. So this again allows churches to be more transparent than the world instead of less transparent than the world. The third, safe church commitment under the transparency pillar is saying no to NDAs and non-competes. Here's the minimum requirement. The church commits to not use non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, and that includes severance packages with non-disparagement clauses. It includes employee handbooks with non-disparagement clauses, and it includes non-compete clauses of any kind. So it may not say it's an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. The document may not say it's a non-compete, but if it has any of those clauses in it, it would still be considered an NDA. So we want to be clear about that. And we talk about not putting NDAs and non-competes also in hiring documents of any kind, because a lot of times those are tucked into hiring documents. Somebody's really excited they got a job at this church, that they're going to get to do ministry. They sign the documents, don't pay attention, and then later they've been silenced. Okay, now I want to make a clarification here. Okay, we got a note on the website about it, but there are some exceptions to NDAs. Okay, I would myself like to just kind of blanket say, let's not do any NDAs of any kind. But the reality is there are some NDAs that are okay, that are not going to silence people from things they don't need to be silenced about. So we do make some allowances for those, and we talk to church leaders about those in this process and train them on those. We review those, okay, to make sure that they are proper NDAs. Some of the exceptions include documents that are specifically limited. Their language is limited to protecting the personal information of parishioners. So things like, hey, if we have an NDA and all it says is you can't disclose any donor information about like how much they give, what they give, how often they give of parishioners, if you come across it. It may be things like, hey, you have access to the church database. In this NDA, all it says is that you won't disclose address information, phone numbers, contact information. You won't disclose those or use those things that you see in the database for your work with the church outside of the church work, okay? So there are some situations where NDAs can be used. They're just specific, they're limited, they're going to follow the rules, and they're always going to be for the protection of parishioners. So if any church leader has questions about what NDAs are acceptable, they can look on the website. We're going to be putting more information about that there, and they can simply, they can contact us. We can set up a call. We can talk about it, okay? That's the minimum requirement, though, is the commitment not to use those. The best practice is to do all of what we talked about in the minimum requirement, commit not to using those things, and to release all previous NDAs and non-competes. This is a church going the extra mile, and they say, not only are we doing this, but if anybody ever signed an NDA or a non-compete with this church, we release you. Okay, and make that public. Put that on your website so that people know, email former staff members, volunteers, if they signed one of those, to let them know. Now, here's the common pushback that we receive. How do people push back against this particular thing, okay? The biggest pushback we get is, Jeff, some of these NDAs are good. They're used to protect parishioners. And we remind people, yes, and we make allowances for those. Any NDAs that are very specific, limited in scope, and protect the confidential information of your parishioners, like their donation information, counseling information from biblical counseling conversations. Of course, those are allowed. We're going to walk you through that. But we remind people, those NDAs should be as specific as possible. They should only be used when absolutely necessary, and over 95% of the documents that we see at SAI go well beyond these parameters, and they serve to silence people more broadly, okay? So that's why we're pushing on these. Another bit of pushback that we get is we'll have some pastors and church leaders who say, Jeff, non-competes keep disgruntled staff members from stealing people from our church, okay? And there are a few different responses I give to this, and I hope that you see in my responses, I can be really kind of, challenging sometimes. I know that I can have a challenging tone to pastors. In these responses, we're not trying to challenge. We're trying to help them understand. We're trying to walk with them, okay? So this may sound challenging, but it's just part of the theological reality of where we're at. I remind them that people are not a commodity, okay? People are not a commodity, and no one can steal people, okay? All churches, we're a part of the same body. We're all a part of the body of Christ. We have the same mission, the great co-mission, and we shouldn't be competing with other churches, okay? So, people have to choose to leave, right? And if people in your church would rather go to another church, that's okay. And it won't usually happen, just to think about this candidly, it won't usually happen unless the person has a stronger relationship with the staff member who left than they do with other people at your church, okay? And the reality is, if they leave, that is painful. I know that is painful. It's not just painful relationally, but it's painful to the bottom line, and it hurts. Guys, been a pastor, I get it. It hurts. But I believe we're better off to bless the people who leave and let them go under that blessing than it is for it to come out that we're using non-compete documents. I think those non-compete documents and just the reality of them causes more damage than not. Also, just practically, non-competes are really difficult to get to hold up in court outside of a very specific non-solicitation clause, okay? And in such cases, the solicitation usually has to be proven substantially. So not just we believe this person solicited our clients in business or solicited our church members. They sent out a bunch of emails and said, hey, come to our church. Now, if you had the emails that say, hey, I want you to come to our church, well, that may break the non-solicitation clause. But most often when people they leave a company and they take clients, or they leave a church and they take parishioners, right? That sort of thing. Most of the time, there's no way to prove that they solicited, okay? Because people are allowed to move. People are allowed to do business with them, okay? So again, it's really hard to get those to hold up in court. But if a church does want to have someone sign, a staff member sign a no solicitation document alone, if it just says, hey, I'm not going to use, like I said earlier, I won't, when I leave, use the church database to proactively reach out and try to steal members, okay? Well, then that's understandable, and it would be allowed under the pledge. However, I don't recommend it. I don't think it's best practice, but we would allow it. With documents like this, though, again, more damage occurs when it comes out that you use them, okay, than the damage that you're attempting to protect your church from on the outset. So we just believe it's really good not to use these documents. And another piece of pushback that we get on NDAs, okay, and then we'll try to move on. But people will say, hey, NDAs keep disgruntled people from bad-mouthing our church and harming our reputation. Now, one thing I always tell pastors, NDAs don't keep people from talking. NDAs keep people from talking publicly, okay? But they're gonna talk to their family and friends. And if they don't talk to their family and friends, what they don't say is going to be more damning than what they do say. The reputational damage that churches face when people leave disgruntled, it often happens anyway, and it's actually worse because of the vague nature and what's not being said. People are reading between the lines. They're making assumptions. But as Scripture teaches it, Scripture teaches us that our responsibility is not to silence people. Our responsibility is to live lives in such a way that all men have to speak well of you. Okay? As church leaders, our reputation, the Bible says it should be good with outsiders. So therefore, we should not have to use a legal document to keep people quiet to protect our reputations, right? And also, if what's said about you, about your church is not true, we already have defamation laws on the books to deal with that. Okay? The document's not needed to hold people accountable for not defaming you or your church, okay? So keep in mind, more damage is going to be done to your reputation when people find out that you're using an NDA than by what people would say in most cases. And if it's not, if more damage would be done by what people say and disclose, then it's likely that shouldn't be hidden anyway, okay? So in our opinion, NDAs are simply not Christ-like, and they're not worth it. A couple other things that people say, they say, Jeff, it's a common business practice or all churches do it. Yes, it is a common business practice, but the business world is not where the church takes its cues from. We take our cues from Scripture. We take our cues from Jesus. And what does Scripture say? Scripture says that we should be above reproach, okay? The use of NDAs always invites reproach. And we should be much more above reproach than the world. We shouldn't act like them. So business is doing it doesn't really mean a lot. Now, beyond that, the type of broad sweeping NDAs and disparagement clauses that we see most often with churches, did you know they were actually made illegal by the National Labor Relations Review Board in early 2023? So the reality is that businesses don't regularly use the type of NDAs that we see churches use. Churches aren't held to the same standard because of separation of church and state and are still allowed to use NDAs that are too broad that businesses wouldn't be able to use, especially outside of executives. And then kind of that last thing, hey, everybody does it. We don't like them, but all churches do this. This is kind of standard practice. We hear that a lot, okay? Here's the thing, though. Throughout church history, there have been a whole lot of practices that were common to the church that were unbiblical, practices that were sinful, and practices that led to massive public reproach. The sale of indulgences was common until the Reformation, right? So we should be asking what's right, what's above reproach, not what other people do. Okay. So again, I think committing to not use NDAs is just, it's way more helpful than it is hurtful. And then the fourth safe church practice under transparency, the disclosure of affiliations and partnerships. So are you a Southern Baptist church? You would disclose that. Are you a Methodist church? You would disclose that. Are you a part of ARC, that church planning network? You would disclose that. Okay. And here's the minimum requirements. Very simple. We simply publicly disclose on our website all of our regular affiliations and partnerships. Then people can choose, okay? If you're not a big fan of ARC, I'm not a big fan of ARC. That doesn't mean that every ARC church is bad, okay? But if someone has an issue with ARC, it's better to let them know that you're connected and affiliated with ARC, or if they have an issue with the Southern Baptist Convention because of the things that have been going on the past couple of years. Well, if they have that issue, it's better for them to know than to come to your church and find out later, okay? So that's the minimum requirement. You just disclose affiliations on your website. The best practice, it takes that public disclosure and it includes any payments or donations made to partners. And if you've got that financial transparency document, you can normally just point back to it. Here is the list of partners that we make financial donations to. So we give money back to ARC, we give money back to the cooperative program, we give money, to this organization, whatever. For details, see our financial disclosure, and then you would just link there. Okay, so what's the common pushback to that one? Okay, and we don't get as much pushback on that one, but we do get a little bit. Sometimes pastors will say, Jeff, we don't want to publicly disclose our partnerships because we don't want to turn people off who maybe have had a bad experience with a certain organization. So this is like when and this was very common in like the late 90s, early 2000s, but when a lot of Baptist churches started renaming their churches as so-and-so community church instead of so-and-so Baptist church. And they stopped putting on their website they were Baptist. I actually remember there was a large church that I was a part of that I had been there for years on staff before I realized we were in cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention. And I only found out because I was asked to go to a local meeting with Baptist leaders, and they asked me to represent the church. And I'm sitting there asking questions like, wait a second, we're Southern Baptist? I didn't know we were Southern Baptist, okay? So a lot of times churches will say that, like, we don't want to turn people off, but here's the deal. A parishioner has the right to know. A parishioner has the right to know your affiliations and partners. And if they've had a bad experience with one of them, then they may not feel safe at your church. Your church may not feel safe to them no matter how safe it is. If they find that out later, they're going to feel like you lied to them. They're going to feel like you withheld information, right? And I think that's a much greater erosion of trust than saying up front, we're a part of this organization. And hey, if that's going to make you feel unsafe, we may not be the best church for you, okay? So again, I think it hurts us longer in the long term. And then the last commitment under the transparency category, the transparency pillar, is a nepotism protection policy. Okay, a nepotism protection policy. Here's the minimum requirement for that. It's a policy outlining exactly how familial relationships among staff and leaders is going to be handled. Okay, and it includes, but is not limited to, deciding for your church. There's no right answer here, but deciding for your church if family members can be hired on staff. I've seen churches that say we're just not hiring family members. I've also seen churches that say, no, it's in everybody's best interest that we hire family members. We just got to be careful about it, okay? It's going to include things, this policy, like how nepotism and the appearance of nepotism, okay? Because sometimes the appearance of nepotism is worse than actually if there's nepotism or not. How is your church going to protect against the appearance of nepotism in the event of staff hires that could look like that, okay? It also is going to detail how family members are going to be kept from reporting to one another. So like one family member doesn't report to another person on staff or falling under the authority of that family member in their job, okay? So I've seen churches where it's like, oh, we're going to hire, we got a pastor, we got his wife, we hire them both. The wife is really in the department of the pastor, but doesn't report to the pastor. Yet the reality is they fell under that pastor's authority. Okay, so there needs to be very detailed ways that we're going to keep that from happening. And these policies are also going to explain, they're going to detail and outline how the church hiring process is going to protect against what I call familial appointments, okay? That if you're going to hire family, how does this policy ensure through hiring processes that when a family member is hired, they are the most qualified person for the job, okay? They're a qualified candidate in the scenarios they're hired, and they weren't just appointed because they were a family member, okay? And all we ask under that minimum requirement is that policy is in place, that it's made available for us to review, and it's made available to the congregation. So just the people within your church, and we review it to make sure, again, that it covers all of the basis to give feedback if there's any place where it may cause issues down the road. Now, the best practice, it takes all of that, and all it adds is a public disclosure of the nepotism policy, the anti-nepotism policy on the church's website. And this lets people who, and again, you could just have a page that says policies and disclosures. It's got all those things on there with, hey, what this is, why we disclosed it, and a link to it. But by doing that, it lets the public know, hey, so maybe there are family members on this church's website, but it makes me feel a lot better because when I look at it, I know they've got a plan to handle this. This isn't just a family-run church where family members can get away with anything, because that can cause unsafe environments. Now, what's our pushback? We get a lot of pushback anytime that we talk about nepotism. So here's some of the pushback. We'll hear from church leaders and church parishioners, Jeff, the Bible is full of examples of kings passing the torch to their sons and fathers passing down land and businesses and inheritance to their sons and daughters, okay? It's not nepotism. That's legacy. It's biblical. And you're right, there are a lot of those examples. What I remind churches of, though, is that pastors are not kings, and the church is not a family business. The church is not property to be inherited, okay? And whether it's nepotism or not, the appearance of nepotism, just the appearance of it, can invite reproach. So if we're going to have family on staff or family in these situations, we need to fight proactively to make sure that we're above that reproach. That's what these policies do. While family should not necessarily be excluded from working together at a church, I think it should be avoided unless it's clearly the best option and it's in line with robust hiring practices. Then if people have questions about it, there's a lot you can go back to be above reproach by placing those parameters, okay, on these hiring practices up front. What we do is we have an answer for concerned people later. When they share those concerns, we should always do that, because then we can stay above reproach and say, hey, we actually thought about that. Here's our nepotism protection policy. It's how we go about that. Hey, we welcome any feedback if you think we missed anything. It helps you to stay above reproach and avoid even the appearance of evil. And I believe that's what most pastors want. They want to be above reproach. They want for themselves and their church to avoid the appearance of evil. That's what that does, okay? The next pillar is accountability, right? Safe churches are transparent. They're accountable and they're protective. So what's under accountability? This is very practical. I think we can move through this pretty quick, okay? Accountability is a lot about governance, okay? And the first safe church practice, safe church commitment that we have under accountability is governance structure. Here's the minimum requirement for that one. The governance and accountability structure for the church is made available to the congregants and SAI for review. So SAI sees it. We can tell people we've looked at it. We can explain what it is if a congregant says, hey, I can't find it, right? But also it's made available to the people in the church, okay? Not public, but to the people in the church. And the governance structure is simply this. It's, hey, who reports to whom? Who has authority over whom? So it may look like this. It may say that the church staff and church volunteers report to the senior pastor, or the volunteers report to the church staff report to the executive team, senior pastor, however you want to put that out. The senior pastor or specific staff members report to and are accountable to the elder board, and the elder board is accountable to the church body. So if there's ever anything that's going on and we don't feel like the elder board is actually holding the staff accountable, then we can bring it to a church vote. That would be one example, okay? There's a lot of different ways of church governance. So we're not saying one is right, one is wrong, but this is just letting the people in your church know This is how our governance structure works, okay? There are people in Presbyterian churches who don't know how Presbyterian governance works. And I'm a big believer in Presbyterian governance. I think more often than not, it works really well, especially when it's done the way and people are held accountable the way that it's designed. But there are people who are in those churches who they haven't been Presbyterian their whole life. They don't really understand how that works. That helps to avoid a lot of issues. Now, the best practice goes a little farther. The governance and accountability structure for the church, it's made publicly available on the website, and that includes all church staff members. One thing that we're noticing is that the more scandals that come out, the more issues that come out, we're seeing more and more large churches who are not putting their staff on the website, okay? It feels like it's easier and it protects us from pushback just by not putting them on the website. But in reality, when something bad happens, it tends to look like you're hiding something. So best practice is to put that on the website. Here's our governance structure, and here's a list of the people in our governance structure and the list of staff members. Now, what's the common pushback that we get from that? We hear a lot of, hey, Jeff, we don't have to publish that because we're not congregationally led, okay? We're elder-led, we're board-led, we're staff-led, whatever. Well, regardless of what your governance structure is, it's important that your parishioners understand how your church is governed, how the church they're a part of is governed. That may not include being congregationally led, but it should include the congregation understanding it. Okay, who's accountable to who? And in the event of impropriety or abuse, who should that be reported to, right? So if a person doesn't know the reporting policy, they should at least have a good idea of who would be responsible for checking into that, making sure those things are held accountable. When we publish that information, it only serves to promote greater levels of transparency and accountability. I don't see any real hurt in that. So do you have to? No. But what's the harm in doing it? There's a lot of harm, and it just feels weird for a church member to not know what the governance structure is of their church, or for someone who's been going to that church and serving at that church, but they just never took the step to become a member. They shouldn't have to find that out in a membership class. It should be available once you start connecting with that church, okay? And when it's available publicly, people can answer those questions before they go to your church. Now, again, we recommend that people don't go to churches if they don't know what the governance structure is. They should at least be able to call and find out. Now, the next safe church commitment under accountability is the governing body. So we talked about the governance structure. Now, this is the actual governing body. Here's the minimum requirement. There's a complete list of officers, directors, trustees, or whoever. It's a complete list of the members of whoever are a part of your church's governing body, okay? It's made available and easily accessible. People don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops to find it. It's made available and easily accessible to congregants and, again, to SAI for review, okay? And you'll see exactly why we're reviewing that here in just a moment, okay? The best practice is you take that complete list of officers, directors, trustees, and you make it available on your website. You make it publicly accessible so that anybody can see, okay, hey, who is in charge of the governance of this website? If you go to most nonprofit websites, you're going to see that. But even if it's not on their website, it has to be included in the 990. Who are our governors and officers? Okay, so again, we want to be more transparent than the world. What's the common pushback we get to publishing the governing body? Okay, we'll hear this. These are regular people. Jeff, these are regular people, or sometimes they're pastors of other churches, and we don't want to put their information out there. We don't want other people to bother them, right? Now, again, secular nonprofits have to list this annually. Most of them list it on their website anyway. You don't have to list the personal information though, right? Like on our 990, we're not going to list the personal addresses and phone numbers of our board members. We're going to tell you who the board members are, and we're going to give you our office address and our office phone number where you can call and talk to them. Okay, we're going to put you in touch with them. We want to make it to where you can contact them, but we're also protecting their personal information, okay? But without that, without people knowing who is responsible for this organization, and without them having a way to contact those people, then it can cause issues with leaders being held accountable. It can cause things to be really hidden under the rug. So again, the church should always strive to be more accountable, more above reproach in the world. That's why we ask churches to do that. That third safe church commitment, the eighth overall, but the third under accountability, is what we call independent governance. And this is why we ask churches to share those governing bodies with us, okay? So that we have the contact information, we know who these people are, and we can confirm, is there enough independence on this board? So here's the minimum requirement for independent governance. At least 2/3 of the voting board members, okay? And like on our board, I sit on our board as the chairman. I help put together, the agendas because I'm day to day in the world of SAI, but I'm not a voting member, okay? So I wouldn't be included in, is the board transparent or not, because I don't get to vote on anything. But at least 2/3 of your voting members are independent. What does independent mean? An independent board member means, one, they're not family. Okay, two, they don't get any significant compensation from the organization. So they might be reimbursed for something they did on behalf of the organization, but they're not getting significant compensation or a paycheck, and it means there's no family ties, okay? So an independent board member, they're not an employee of the church, they're not getting any significant compensation from the church, and they're not a family member to any other board members, and they're not a family member to any significant staff who are in that church. And the last thing, they're local, okay? That's a part of our minimum requirement. They're local. Now, here's what local means to us. They either live in the same city or they live within 100 miles of your church location. The reason why we say that is that there are some churches who say our entire governing board, our overseers, are churches from pastors from other churches across the country. They all live more than 100 miles away. Well, the problem there is those board members become independent, kind of almost absentee landlords because they can't see what's going on. So we want them to be independent, at least 2/3 of the board to be independent and to be local. Now that still allows you to have people who are farther away. It still allows you to have, some family members who sign the nepotism protection policy and the conflict of interest policy, right? But the majority of the board, 2/3, should be independent. Now here's our best practice. Our best practice is instead of 2/3, we ask that 90% of the board members be independent and local, and we ask that 25% of the voting members, okay, not only be independent and local, but at least 1/4 of them don't attend your church regularly. So that could be another pastor in your community. It could be a member of another church in your community. And the reason why we ask people to do that is two things. One, if 90% of your board members who are voting need to be independent, then that means, you're going to have at least a 10-person board. It's going to need to be robust for the pastor and church staff to start sitting in on that. Okay, so you can have pastor and church staff, but the more pastors and church staff you have on the board, the more people you're going to need to have on your board who are independent, okay? Just to make sure we're protecting. A lot of boards consist of heavy staff members, and staff members just, look, I can't hold accountable the person who signed my paycheck. It just doesn't work. The reason why we ask for at least 1/4, 25% of your board to not be a part of your church is, hey, when crap hits the fan, when allegations are made, none of us want to believe that our pastors could be a part of abuse. None of us want to believe anything bad about our church. There is an inherent conflict of interest that gets created there that we can't define on a policy, okay? I'm volunteering at this church. I've been at this church. I'm a part of this church. It's difficult for me to see with an independent perspective. By having at least a few people on your board, 25% of your board, that, hey, they're there, they're local, they're independent, but maybe they go to a different church most weeks, and every 6 to 8 weeks they come and visit your church to see what's going on. They can offer an outside perspective. So here's the common pushback that we get. People will say, Jeff, outside overseers who pastor other churches, they give us better accountability because they give us better accountability than parishioners because they get ministry. They understand it. And look, there is truth to that. But even though there's truth to that, outside overseers, when they're over 100 miles away, they don't know what's happening in the day-to-day life of the church. And like I said, in outside overseer-only situations, the governing body tends to act like absentee landlords. They don't know what's going on the ground. They're going to miss important information, and they live too far away to see the church engage what's happening in the culture consistently, okay? Now, another piece of pushback, people ask the question, Jeff, why would we want outside overseers? They don't understand our ministry like people inside do. We can follow everything else there, but that best practice is hard. Why would we have people outside of our church? And again, we talked about this a moment ago, but the truth is this, At the same time, the people in your church are so heavily invested and they're so close to the decisions that are being made, it can be really hard to not default to protecting the organization, to protecting the status quo over doing the right thing. Because the right thing can feel like protecting this organization I care about, protecting these people I know, right? Like a lot of times we'll hear board members say, but we know our pastor's a good man. Well, it may be true that your pastor has been a good man, is a good man, and made a boneheaded decision that hurt people. Both can be true at the same time. And by having some outside voices, it helps us to get both the inside and outside perspectives, okay? And the last bit of pushback that we get on that, we'll have people who say, Jeff, we're a family ministry, man. We're family. We're close friends. We're business associates. We all serve on the board together. But here's the deal. Conflicts of interest arise too often to avoid with simply a policy when that's the situation. When everybody on the board is my close friend or a family member or this, that, or the other. Independent governance is the best practice, not only for churches, but secular nonprofits and corporations as well. Because where the governance is not primarily or the majority independent, we tend to have greater issues, greater conflicts of interest, greater issues, allegations all the way around. The next one is very, very simple. Kind of the fourth commitment here under the accountability pillar. It's your bylaws. And the minimum requirement is that we ask the church to take their governing bylaws for the church to make sure they're updated and available to the congregation. And then outside of the people in your church, they're made available for us to look at, again, feedback. And then if anybody was to call who's not a part of your church, they could call SAI and say, hey, Jeff, this church is on your Silver Safe Church list. We don't see their bylaws on their website, but we had a question. Could you answer it? We're thinking about visiting this church, but we want to make sure first. Well, we can answer that for them. We're not going to just send them your bylaws because you don't want to make that public yet, but we will be able to answer their questions or be able to put them in contact with you, right, to make sure they get that information, all right? But that's the minimum requirement. The best practice is that the governing bylaws for the church are updated regularly and they're made public on the website. Again, a policies and procedures page, policies and protection page, whatever, policies and disclosure, it's all on there. Somebody can click it. They can see the bylaws. Again, most people are not going to read these, but for the people who do need those, a lot of times they've been through significant trauma. It doesn't hurt. It just shows accountability, right? And again, those are usually able to be found. Those documents are somewhere for nonprofits who have set up. We need to make sure that we have those available as well. Now, here's the common pushback we get with this. People will simply ask, Jeff, why should we take this step? This just seems like an extra hoop to jump through when most people in our church, they don't know how to read bylaws and they're definitely not going to read them anyway, all right? My question to that, though, is instead of why would we jump through this extra hoop, why not? This is a really simple, really easy step to increase transparency and accountability. And by doing something as simple as providing these documents linked on your website, it's a really easy way to foster an open environment of accountability and, again, operate above reproach. So there's just not a lot of downsides. And, you would be surprised how often we hear from people going, I want to see this church's bylaws, okay? It's something that we look at. So it's very important, okay? And the last part of accountability, the last commitment is a leave policy, okay? Now, here's what the leave policy means. Here's the minimum requirement. The church has created a policy for paid and unpaid leave, okay? It's not just created, but it's adopted. It's officially adopted by the organization for leaders facing allegations, okay? Any allegations of immorality, abusive leadership, criminal misconduct, all of that. That policy is adopted, it's in place, and it's made available to the congregants, and again, SAI. What does this leave policy do? It decides in advance how we're going to handle it when an allegation is made that may make it inappropriate for a pastor or staff member or leader or even volunteer to continue serving in that capacity in the church. But we also don't want to hurt them, hurt their family, fire them when we don't know if it's valid yet, okay? So this would allow the churches, and all of these policies are going to look different. They just need to decide, hey, what is unpaid leave? Like, it's so kind of crazy and out there. This person's definitely broken some rules and policies within our church. So we're not going to pay them. But most importantly, what is paid leave? okay? If we're worried, hey, we want to find the truth, we want to protect victims, but we don't want to entertain false allegations and just fire someone. Well, okay, well, what does your paid leave policy look like so that you can be above reproach, put that person on paid leave? We're not saying they're innocent or guilty. We're just putting them on administrative leave while we figure this out, okay? Now, the best practice is to have all of that above, to have that policy, and again, simply make it public on the church's website on that policies and disclosures page. What's our common pushback there? We'll have people who say, having a preset policy is too hard. Jeff, every situation's different, and man, we need to handle these on a case-by-case basis, okay? We hear that a lot. But the truth is, if you wait to make those decisions when scandal or allegations arise, one, it's going to delay the decision, okay? Because there's going to be surprise and shock to everybody involved. It's also, the more it delays the decision, it's going to increase the outrage of the public, okay? Because the public is looking. People who are connected to these potential victims are looking. And the reality is it's going to be very difficult to decide what to do under pressure, okay? When an allegation is made about a leader that you've served with or someone that you love, it is really hard under pressure to make the right decision because you know this person, okay? But knowing a person and knowing good things about them doesn't mean that they couldn't have done bad things, okay? We're all capable of doing things that can hurt people. By deciding in advance, we reduce the time that's required to take action, okay? We reduce the pressure. We reduce the burden that's felt by the decision makers in the time of crisis. We deciding in advance, make sure that we make the right decision, and we make it easy when it's the hardest. When it's the easiest to make a bad decision, we made a good decision. Easy, okay? And when the policy is public, everyone involved knows what should happen, what the next steps are. Let's say there's a news report coming out. They can say, hey, we've already looked. They put this person on leave as per their policy. It removes the ambiguity and reduces the risk of mishandling a crisis situation and further harming victims, okay? A lot of the greatest damage that's done is in how churches mishandle allegations when they do arise, all right? And now this brings us to our last pillar. We talked about transparency. We talked about accountability. The last pillar is protective measures, and this is pretty easy to get through. But the first protective measure that we have that churches commit to in the Safe Church pledge is a trauma-informed staff. They commit to be trauma-informed. So the minimum requirement is that all pastoral staff, everybody who's on staff and has a pastoral or director title, they've completed a trauma-informed training in the past 3 years, okay? So when somebody gets hired, they have a year or so to do this, or 6 months or so to do this, depending on the policy they adopt. And then every 3 years, they have to do that again, okay? This, again, it just makes sure that we can respond in a world where people have faced so much trauma and where the church has been a part of that. We want to be trauma-informed and make sure that our responses don't accidentally, oftentimes unintentionally, re-traumatize someone or make the trauma worse. Now, the best practice is that all staff, pastoral and non-pastoral, so everybody on staff, all the volunteers and your board members have completed a trauma-informed training annually, okay? Now, we do make allowances. I believe that we've changed that pledge to where it's all board members and staff complete it annually, and volunteers complete that training every 3 years, okay? They do that every 3 years. And that just makes sure that everybody who is potentially counseling people, doing ministry with people, that they at least have some training to be more trauma-informed. The common pushback that we get is people will say, Jeff, it seems like an unnecessary step. The Bible doesn't talk about trauma-informed training. The Bible doesn't require it. It's just putting more on our already busy staff. And man, I get that. I get the staffs are really busy already. But the greatest trauma that abuse victims face, like I said, it's often from the second wound. It often comes from poor responses after disclosing abuse or inappropriate actions. And based on the number of harmful responses that churches have made over the past decade in situations like this, it seems like a really easy step to take to care for people, right? And look, I understand that your church staff is busy, but taking a few hours of training to better care for people and make sure that the church is making wise decisions, it makes as much sense as doing CPR training and child safety training, which a lot of churches are going to be doing annually. If you're not doing that annually, you probably should be doing that annually. That's normally going to fall in your child protection policy, right? But biblically, the greatest commandment, you talk about, the Bible doesn't talk about being trauma-informed. Here's what the Bible does talk about. The greatest commandment is to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Becoming trauma-informed is a practical way to better love our neighbors. It's a really practical way to practice the golden rule that Jesus gave us, and both are necessary for the church according to our Savior. Now, the second commitment that we find under protective measures is that the church has a whistleblower and reporting policy, okay? And by whistleblower policy, we don't just mean for criminal allegations, but it's any misconduct. So the basic requirement is that a holistic reporting policy is in place for the private reporting of sin and abuse concerns that protects the reporter from retaliation. Now, that doesn't mean the reporter is anonymous. It means it's private, that their abuser isn't going to immediately know who it is. We don't want to send somebody that we say, oh, well, Matthew 18, you got to go talk to them first. And then we're putting someone who is a potential abuse victim face-to-face with their abuser. That doesn't make sense, and we've done other videos on it. That's not what Matthew 18 means, okay? So this policy is all about protecting people who report sin and misconduct, protecting them from retaliation, okay? Now, if an investigation is done and it turns out that everything they said was false, well, we got to deal with that, okay? What we're talking about is protecting them from retaliation just because they reported. And as a minimum requirement, this policy should be made available and easily accessible both to SAI for review and to, again, the congregation, members, and attenders of this church. The best practice is doing all of that, and you probably guessed it by now, making it publicly available on your website for anybody to look at, especially people who are coming in to your church, right? So what's the common pushback that we get on a whistleblower and reporting policy? We'll have people who tell us, Jeff, we already have a whistleblower policy. We already have it in the Bible. It's called Matthew 18, right? It's about church discipline. But the problem is, and I don't want to mess with people's theology, okay, but let's just look at this for what it says. Matthew 18 is not contextually about church discipline, okay? The heading in your Bible is going to say church discipline, but the heading in your Bible is not inspired. The heading in your Bible was added by translators, and it's actually a fairly new thing in Bibles when you look at the whole of church history. But Matthew 18 is not contextually about church discipline. And how do we know that? Because the church wasn't born yet. The assembly of believers in Jesus wasn't born yet, because this was Jesus talking about this before the cross. But more importantly, Matthew 18, and again, we go into depth about this in other videos, Matthew 18 is about conflict between brothers. Brothers are peers. In situations of abuse from a spiritual leader, or impropriety or sin or criminal misconduct by someone with spiritual authority over you, Matthew 18, like I said earlier, would require victims to confront their abuser directly and privately, or someone might have to report wrongdoing to the people who sign their checks, okay? I'm not going to report wrongdoing if it's going to cost me my job. Now, hopefully I would, right? But the reality is a lot of people don't in churches. So often, trying to push Matthew 18 as a whistleblower policy, it results in more trauma, and it results in people staying silent out of fear. Now, I would say 1 Timothy 5:19 through 20 more contextually applies to handling sin and allegations against church leaders, right? One, it says, don't entertain an accusation against an elder without 2 or 3 witnesses, which is why we have independent investigations, which is what we're going to talk about next, right? But also, it says that when a leader does sin, we should reprimand them publicly and take care of that publicly so that everybody learns from it and people are less likely to sin in the church. Whistleblower policies, they help victims, they help parishioners, and they help the staff to all safely report sin, safely report criminal activity, and ensure the allegations are investigated by a neutral third party, right? And that is the next, okay? That is the third commitment that people make, that churches make in or under the protective measures situation, the protective measures pillar. That's committing to an independent investigation policy. And all that is you're putting on paper when we're going to do an independent investigation, how we're going to trigger it, and who are our first 3 calls. Who are the first 3 organizations that we're going to call to do that independent investigation? So the minimum requirement is this: a policy is in place for triggering independent investigations that includes when independent investigations should occur and the process for choosing that investigator. So you may say our first call is going to be to Grace, godly response to abuse in Christian environments. Our second call is to Guidepost Solutions. Our third call is going to be to this law firm. Doesn't matter where they're at. You just decide in advance. And then the policy should be made available and easily accessible to people inside your church and SAI. Okay. The best practice, again, you probably can go ahead and guess. It's all of those things, and this policy is made available on the church's website. Now, this one's a game changer because it lets people who have been around spiritual abuse understand if anything goes wrong in this church, they're committed to the truth. Independent investigations is not just about believing the person who alleged the misconduct, right? It's about protecting victims and protecting staff, protecting people from false allegations, okay? The common pushback we hear from a lot of churches, Jeff, we don't need an external investigation. We can do an internal investigation. We don't need people outside of our church to be in our business, okay? But the truth is, there's no way that people inside your church can conduct a true independent investigation because there will inevitably in that situation be conflicts of interest. Everybody would have to recuse themselves. But also, let's think about this. Church boards, deacons, and pastors are not usually equipped to conduct investigations. And when they attempt to, the results and the findings are often easily discredited because we don't know the questions to ask. We don't know that there's certain things that we can do and ask that cause more harm than good. So the only true way to accomplish 1 Timothy 5:19 and 20 in a way that's above reproach, okay, is to commission an independent investigation. When criminal abuse or allegations arise, you go ahead and you start an independent third-party investigation. None of us want to believe it when these things happen, but when we decide in advance when and how to trigger a third-party investigation, we remove our bias, okay? We remove slow responses, and we remove even the appearance of mishandling the situation. All right, and we're getting toward the last few parts of the Safe Church Pledge, right? So stay with me and then I'll explain to you how you can be a part of getting this done in your churches. But the next marker is staff care. It's staff care, and here's the minimum requirement for staff care. A standard severance policy is in place for terminated employees, okay? That includes any cause or reasons that you could withhold severance. So maybe you would say there's no severance if criminal activity, they were arrested and that's why they were fired, right? Anything like that could be put in there, but you either have that policy for how you do severances or your church just opts in to pay unemployment insurance, okay? Now, the best practice is that the policy is in place for terminated employees and it grows based on their tenure on staff, okay? So it also includes like PTO, vacation time, things like that. If your church has that, that would be paid out on departure as well. We think that's better to do that as a best practice. People who have been on your staff for longer, they're probably going to have a harder time finding a secular job if something happens. Now, why do we do this though? We do this because often churches don't have to legally pay into unemployment. So when a church staffer is fired, they can't collect unemployment. And a lot of times the only way they're going to get a severance is if they sign an NDA. Okay. Now we've already asked churches to commit to not signing NDAs, but we want to make it harder for them to renege on that commitment because they could say that and then potentially try to still use them. And the only person who could tell us would be the staff member, but they're not going to get a severance and be able to take care of their family unless they sign this. Okay. So by committing to this, they've got a policy that we can see that says this is how we're going to pay out severances, okay? And the point is we need to make sure that these church staff members, when they are fired, terminated, that they have a way to take care of their family and they're not forced or coerced into silence about impropriety because they need money to take care of their family, okay? Now, what's the common pushback on that staff care? Churches will tell us, one, we don't have to pay unemployment. It's too expensive and we don't need the government telling us, Jeff, how to run our church. And the truth is, yeah, you don't. Unemployment is just one way to accomplish staff care, okay? And we really just put that out there to say, if you don't want to make the severance policy is the easiest way to do this. But if you don't want to do that and you don't want to deal with it, just pay for unemployment insurance like every business is required to, okay? But for most churches, deciding on a standard severance policy in advance, that's what's going to work best. And why are we doing this? We're doing this for a couple of reasons. One, your staff are still sheep who are a part of your church body, and they need to be pastored. They need to be cared for. Second, when church staff are terminated and they don't have unemployment or severance, again, they're more likely to be coerced into signing NDAs in order to get that severance just so they can take care of the needs of their family. But when we provide a policy like this, what are we doing? We're ensuring that our staff is cared for, and we remove the incentive for silencing and coercion. So all around, it makes it easier, pastors, for your churches to operate above reproach. And this next commitment is actually for senior pastors. It's providing counseling or making counseling available for senior pastors. The minimum requirement is licensed counseling is made available to the senior pastor on at least a quarterly basis that would be paid for the church. Now, the pastor may say, I don't want it. They may not have to do it, but are you making it available and saying, as a church, we'll pay for this if you need it, if you want it? The best practice is the same thing, but it's made available monthly if churches want it, so that pastors could do at least 12 sessions a month if they wanted, and it's made available on at least a quarterly basis to all of the church staff. Now, why do we do that, though? The reason why we're asking for that minimum requirement or best practice with counseling is because pastors and church staff, they carry heavy burdens. They experience a lot of secondary trauma. When they're caring for parishioners well, they're going to experience a lot of secondary trauma, and there's so much negative effect from that. But if we can ensure that our pastors are healthy, that our church staff are healthy pastors, healthy leaders tend to lead safer churches, okay? So the common pushback that we get on this one, people will say, Jeff, why does it have to be licensed counseling? Biblical counseling is enough. Why should we turn to the world when we've got the word? Our pastors, they're even trained as biblical counselors, so they shouldn't need counseling, okay? But again, like I said, pastors experience a lot of secondary trauma, and the data is clear. There's significant damaging effects to people and negative impacts of people who experience secondary trauma. Also, biblical counselors are not generally equipped to handle this, okay? I've been trained in biblical counseling. I had biblical counseling classes. They didn't talk about trauma and secondary trauma. And while a pastor should never be required, no one should be required to see a licensed therapist if they don't want to, giving them the option is just helpful. Think about what happens, leaders, if our people in our churches even, what happens when our church leaders can't get help, but they need it? The result is almost always a public scandal, and both the pastors and the victims end up getting hurt and experiencing trauma that will never fully go away. Providing an option for pastors who are in need to reach out to get help and to stay healthy, it seems like it's well worth the effort. And if licensed counseling is your only pushback, we're willing to work with churches to brainstorm other ways of potential care and other safety options that would ensure that their pastors have access, their senior leaders have access to mental health care, things that are going to help them to stay safe and healthy. So we're open to conversations about that if that's the only pushback, okay? Now, let's get into the last one. What is the last commitment on the Safe Church Pledge? And this is under the protective measures thing, right? The protective measures pillar. It's child, teen, and adult protection policies, okay? Here's the minimum requirement. And we don't get nearly as much pushback on this one, right? Individual and specific protection policies are in place to protect children from abuse. There's a separate policy to protect teens from abuse because how they're protected, what their programs look like, what their events look like, it's very different. And there's a policy in place, a plan in place. That's all a policy is. It's a plan, okay, a written plan that is in place to protect adults from adult clergy SA, okay? Adult clergy SA is essentially, if a pastor has an affair and a sexual relationship with someone who's outside their church, that's an affair, okay? It's sinful. It's not criminal, okay? But if a pastor has a sexual relationship with someone inside their church, That's not an affair. That would be adult clergy SA. Why? Because it's a sexual relationship with someone that pastor has spiritual authority over. It does a lot more damage, causes a lot more trauma, and it often takes a really long time for victims of that to realize that wasn't consensual like I thought it was. Because there's again, we shouldn't be having those types of relationships with people who are under our care. Man, there's rules for people like counselors, therapists, stuff like that to keep them from having those damaging relationships. There's not rules for pastors, so we need to put those in place. Now, all those policies for children, for teens, for adults, they're put in place, they're made available to the church, they're made available to SAI for review, and the church commits to review them annually, okay? A lot of times these policies need to be updated and changed as the world changes around us, so we're just going to review them, update as necessary annually. The best practice is, again, we put all three of those policies in place, okay? And we include spiritual abuse protections and adult clergy SA protections in the adult policy. But again, the policies are made available publicly. Now, what's the common pushback? There's not a lot of pushback that we hear regarding child and teen safety. Most churches have these. They have to have these for insurance and everything else. Most parishioners understand we want to and need to keep our children, our teens, and our minors safe, okay? Now, at the same time, we don't receive a lot of pushback, but the majority of churches we find, they haven't made these policies publicly available even to congregants. They just say, yeah, we've got policies in place to keep you safe. But it's important for people to know, okay, well, what does that mean? What are the ratios you're going to have in rooms? What are the things you're going to do? And we're not talking about giving security diagrams in these policies. You don't want to do that. That's counterproductive. But just telling people what are the things that we're doing to keep children safe. Now, on adult policies, we will get a little bit of pushback, okay? The biggest pushback on the adult policies is people want to call this a moral failure between two consenting adults instead of adult clergy SA. But again, the truth is a parishioner or a staff member can't really consent as a peer to a sexual relationship with someone who has spiritual authority over them, okay? It's just a different dynamic, and our leaders who have spiritual authority over us need to be held to a higher standard. Now, not only that, multiple states have laws on the books now about adult clergy SA. More are likely going to follow suit. And when a pastor has a sexual relationship with someone under their care, it's an abuse of power. It's an abuse of authority. It's an abuse of their situation. So again, to be a consensual affair between adult peers, it would have to be between a pastor or a staff member and someone outside the church. But by creating a protection policy around this, guys, for adults, it helps protect parishioners against adult clergy SA and spiritual abuse. Making it public, making it available to your congregation, that lets people know that you're taking abuse of all kinds seriously, okay? And you really take seriously the safety of church members, and you want to increase trust in your church. So that's the Safe Church Pledge. It's what each commitment is, what it means, why we're doing it, and the common pushback we hear from pastors, because you may hear some of this pushback if you're a parishioner trying to get your church to sign this, okay? I'm going to try to stop hitting the mic constantly. I'm moving my hands a lot today, but guys, I get excited about this because I think this could change the landscape of the church. I believe this would have impacted so many scandals that we've seen. Now, let's talk about the why behind this, though. You may be asking, why should my church? Yes, why should your church take the Safe Church Pledge? And here's the deal. When churches commit to transparency, accountability, and protection, everyone wins. First, your congregation wins. When people know that their church is operating with integrity, what happens? They feel safe. They're free to worship. They're free to grow. They feel more free to trust their leaders without fear or hesitation because they know their church is committed and has done the work to safety. Second, your church's reputation wins. Signing the Safe Church Pledge tells your community that you are serious about doing things the right way. You're building a legacy of trust, okay? that's going to attract people who are looking for safe, Christ-centered churches, right? We have people all the time. They say, Jeff, can you recommend a safe church in our area, okay? And we can never guarantee that a church is safe, but we want to get to the point where we can say, we recommend churches in your area on this safe church list. Go and look that up. Here's why we recommend those. Those aren't perfect churches, but those are churches that have made a significant commitment to safety, to accountability, to transparency, and to protective measures. And then finally, the church as a whole wins. Not just your church as a whole, the Big C church, the global church, right? The church as a whole wins because every time a church takes this step, it's a victory for the gospel. It's a way to show the world that we're not just about words, we're about action. We want to live out safety. We want to live out love for our neighbor. We want to live out the fruit of the Spirit. And we recently, at SAI, we finished up a survey. We haven't published it yet. We're going to be publishing this study, this research study, very soon. It's going to be on the website. But we completed a research study, and here's what we did. But we looked at 100 churches that faced public scandal in the last 10 years. And honestly, we could have generated almost the entire list of 100 churches facing scandal. We could have done that from the past 2 years. That's how prevalent this kind of thing has become, okay? It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for the churches and for the victims, and no one wins in these situations. And they're happening so often. We could have put a list of 100 churches facing public scandal together from just the last 2 years. That's crazy. We got to do something about that. Here's the thing, though. All of those scandals would have either been avoided, limited in their negative effects, or at minimum, they would have been handled in a less destructive way if those churches had previously committed and instituted the 16 safe church practices on the Safe Church Pledge. Now, look, the reality is this pledge and no other system, there's nothing that can do this. This pledge can't guarantee abuse-free environments. Nothing can do that, but it does offer significant protection. And in the churches that commit to all 16 safe church practices, especially the ones that commit to the best practices, spiritual abuse is incredibly hard to get away with, and it's even harder to hide. And when allegations, if allegations arise, these practices they've committed to protect everyone, and they lead to better outcomes and consistently better responses. I'll give you a real-world example. Just this morning, I saw a news report about a defamation case between a pastor, former pastor of an SBC church, and the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, here's what happened. Essentially, the Southern Baptist Convention, they face a lot of scandal, not reporting and handling abuse correctly. Well, now they're facing this lawsuit because they reported abuse allegations to this pastor's church, and he was fired. But since then, multiple private investigations have exonerated him and proved these allegations false. Okay, that's according to the news report that I read. Now, while statistics show that the majority of abuse allegations turn out to be true, there are always going to be some that are false. We know that. Now, because false allegations can happen, and in this situation, the investigation showed that these didn't all have merit. Because of this, the pastor's suing for defamation because he lost his job, he lost his career, he lost all of that. His reputation was hurt, and all this came out before an investigation was done, right? And so far, he's had success in almost every key challenge he's made. The SBC's tried to have this thrown out for a variety of different reasons, and the courts have sided with this pastor each time. Now, here's the worry that abuse advocates have. Advocates for abuse are worried that the threat of defamation lawsuits like this are going to make churches and whole denominations much less likely to address abuse allegations in the future. But the reality is that's incredibly short-sighted. These 16 safe church practices, they would have helped all the way around to protect churches and denominations against not only not handling abuse correctly, not protecting victims, but against defamation lawsuits. When handled correctly and consistently, these things are going to help because first off, there would have been a clear reporting mechanism for this person that wouldn't have been completely just anonymous like it was with the SBC. It would have been private, not anonymous, but private and protected. Okay, it would have protected the victim from having to report these allegations to their abuser. But second, it would have had leave and investigation policies already in place. So this pastor wouldn't have been able to be fired because the church would have already decided in this situation, we got to put him on paid leave until we find out the truth. So now people aren't upset that this pastor is still in place with these allegations. And when the investigation's completed and we get information, if they're proven false, this person's reputation hasn't been completely smeared and they still have a job. They have all those things, right? The pastor in question would not have been able to lose his job under those leave policies. He wouldn't have been able to be fired, right? And then when the investigation was complete, okay, whether the investigations were proven false, likely, or true, it would have allowed the church to make an informed employment decision for the clergy member, not only based on what happened, but also based on their ability to continue to lead above reproach based on the facts and findings of the investigation. Such an independent investigation would have made a defamation case almost impossible, okay? The response would have protected both the alleged victim and the pastor while the investigation gathered facts and evidence, and moreover, other elements like robust publicly available protection policies, it would have made this whole thing less likely to happen and begin with, because it would have protected this staff member from getting into situations that would have been investigated. When we have great policies about child protection and teen protection, adult protection, it helps remove a lot of the situations that allegations could be made about. It helps us to be above reproach. So again, while no system's perfect, and the Safe Church Pledge is not perfect, do you see how much of a difference this pledge would have made on a practical level in both of these cases, right? Or in this case and in cases like it. In every single case that we've reviewed of spiritual abuse, of immorality, of criminal allegations, I believe the Safe Church Pledge would have limited the damage done, and in many cases, more often than not, avoided the abuse entirely, and it would have protected everyone involved. And here's my hope for the future. My hope is that in the future, we can have entire denominations and associations like the Southern Baptist Convention commit to these kind of safety practices. Okay, because we're watching an entire denomination struggle on how to prevent abuse when the answers are often so simple. Let's commit to practices like this, and let's be publicly transparent, accountable about them. Okay, so let's finish the podcast this way. How can you get involved? Whether you're a pastor or whether you're a parishioner, just a concerned community member, we want to help you to be able to get involved. And you may be saying, Jeff, this is great, but what next? What can I do? Okay, well, here's the simple process, and let's start with church leaders. And that's not only church staff, that's deacons, that's elders, that's high-level volunteers, anybody who would feel like you're a church leader with influence. We'd ask you to do three things. The first thing is sign the pledge. Head over to spiritualabuse.institute's website, sign the pledge. There's a one-time fee of $500 to cover the resources, the accountability, the follow-up with you over the 18 months. But if your church can't afford that or needs financial assistance, we're not turning any church down because the money, that one-time charge is going to cover, again, for as long as we are an organization. We hope that's the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Actually, the hope is that at some point we're not an organization because spiritual abuse is so rare, okay? But as long as spiritual abuse is happening, we're going to be doing this work. And as long as we're doing this work, you're never going to have to pay for that again, okay? This makes sure that $500 fee makes sure that, one, you have the resources, training, and accountability available, and it helps churches that maybe can't afford that, okay? So again, if you need financial assistance, don't let that hold you back. But the first thing, sign the pledge. The second thing, commit to the process. You're going to have 18 months to implement these 16 practices. And guys, again, you're going to have plenty of support along the way. You are not alone. We're going to make sure you have everything down to the templates and documents to get this thing done. And then the last thing, spread the word. Don't just sign the pledge. Talk to your congregation about this and talk to your church about why this matters. Get them excited about being a part of a church that's committed to leading with integrity, and share the pledge with other churches in your network. Imagine the impact that we could have if every church in your community made these kind of commitments. Man, what kind of impact could we have in restoring the reputation and so much of the trust that's been lost in the local church in recent years and decades? Now, if you're not a church leader, I want to give you three things that you can do as well is very simple. First, look over the pledge. Go to spiritualabuse.institute, click on the Safe Church Pledge, and familiarize yourself with it. There's more information than we talked about today. There's a frequently asked questions section. Familiarize yourself with the pledge and ask any questions that you may have about it. And then again, sign up on our website, spiritualabuse.institute. Sign up to participate in the Spiritual Abuse Awareness Weekend. We're going to be publishing another episode later this week, hopefully, where we talk about the Spiritual Abuse Awareness Weekend, give you more information about that. That's another one of our huge projects that we've been planning, not just for this January in Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month, but in every Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month. But you can sign up at no cost, and we're just going to tell you how you can participate in Spiritual Abuse Awareness Weekend and helping us to spread awareness about spiritual abuse, how to create safe churches. And then the last thing that we ask you to do, right, because this is a part of Spiritual Abuse Awareness Weekend, is we're going to ask you on Spiritual Abuse Awareness Weekend, would you ask your church or another local church in your community to sign the Safe Church Pledge? And this isn't a gotcha moment or anything like that. You're just asking them, would you be willing to make these practical commitments to safety? And tell them why we're doing this. We're trying to get 1,000 churches to sign this pledge over the next couple of years so that we can begin providing safe church environments. And again, change the reputation that the church has now in some places where it's much poorer than we want it to be. And most importantly, to protect people and make sure they're safe in our churches. Now, here's probably, in my opinion, the absolute coolest part of the Church Safe Pledge. All right, this is the part I'm most excited about. After a church implements the 16 practices, okay, and again, we give them 18 months to do that, you get to hold them accountable. It's not just about us. We're going to help hold them accountable too, but you get to hold them accountable. The pledge is going to put accountability and a voice back in the hands of the Christian public. You will know exactly what the church is committed to, right? And if what you see doesn't line up, all you have to do is reach out to us. And what we'll do, we're going to have a simple and clear way very soon here in the coming weeks where you can report directly on our website. If there's a church that's on the Safe Church Pledge list, either list, that are not doing what they committed to, you reach out to a concern with a concern, and we're going to reach out to you and the church to try to remedy the issue. Okay. And we're working on a way to do that where we make sure that we get a lot of contact requests. Some of you may know we can't respond to every single contract request that we get. Sometimes it takes a while. We're going to make sure that these church pledge issues, though, that they're coming directly to people and that we're getting those taken care of really, really fast, right? So we'll reach out. If you do that, we're going to reach out to the church. We're going to let them know what's going on. We're going to try to help them fix it. And only if they don't fix it, right? But if they don't fix it, we place them on a lapsed list. And everybody can see that publicly available lapsed list. And not only will it be on that list, it will explain exactly why they're lapsed on their pledge. So, for example, if a church stops providing the financial disclosures they're supposed to parishioners, and you're a concerned church member, you reach out and contact us. We're going to reach out to the church. We're going to ask them what's going on. And if they fix it, we're going to alert you, hey, they fixed it. We're going to move on, okay? If not, though, we'll place them on the lapsed list with a public disclosure that says this church is lapsed because they're no longer providing the financial disclosures that they committed to provide, okay? So it'll be very specific. That puts accountability back in your hand, right? It puts accountability in all of our hands, which is a good thing for every single person in the church. It is far past time that everyday Christians got their voice back. And the truth is, we all have a role to play in building accountable, transparent, and protective churches. Now, remember, we said this at the beginning. This isn't about checking boxes. It's not about jumping through hoops. It's not about following rules. This is about living out our calling as the church of Jesus to protect the vulnerable, to steward our resources wisely, and most of all, to represent Jesus well. So there it is. There it is. There's the Safe Church Pledge. Friends, it's practical, it's biblical, and it's exactly what we need to rebuild trust in the church. If you're a pastor listening to this, I challenge you, would you take this step? Would you begin conversations to have your church take the Safe Church Pledge? If you're a congregant, Would you share this episode with your church leadership? And would you start the conversation between now and Spiritual Abuse Awareness Weekend? Or if you're listening to this after, would you start the conversation? You can start it any week of the year. Would you just start the conversation about limiting spiritual abuse and doing everything we can to become safe churches? Now, here's what I believe. I believe wholeheartedly God is not done with his church. Yes, we made a lot of mistakes, and we've got a long way to go. But when we commit to transparency, accountability, and protecting people, we're stepping back into the kind of leadership that honors God and it reflects his heart. So, guys, thanks. Thanks for listening to this episode. I know this was different. I've got some incredible guests coming pretty early in the year. We got a couple of these solo episodes because of the spiritual abuse awareness campaign and resources we're doing. But you're about to hear from some incredible voices, so it's not just going to be me. Now, if you're not subscribed already, make sure that you're following this podcast, you're subscribed, share this episode, leave a rating and a review. Make sure that by doing that, you're turning notifications on, all that sort of good stuff. When you do that, you make sure that you're not missing any of the incredible episodes coming up with some fantastic guests, that you are always the first to know about new resources like the Safe Church Pledge, Spiritual Abuse Awareness Weekend, some of the other things that are coming. We want to make sure that you know about that. And by leaving a rating, a review, or sharing this episode, you help more people join the conversation about stopping spiritual abuse. So we're grateful for every single one of you. We're grateful for all of your support. And if you want to support Church Disrupted and SAI financially, you can always do that by heading to the Spiritual Abuse Institute. You can head to our website. You can do that right here. Every single gift is tax deductible, and we provide those financial disclosures that we ask other churches and ministries to do. But that's it for today. What step are you going to take to help churches commit to safe church practices and the Safe Church Pledge in your community? And hey, if you got questions, go ahead and ask them in the comments below. We're going to answer as many of those as we can. If you got concerns, you got feedback, let us know. We want to invite you into the conversation, and we will consistently every single year be doing our best to make this Safe Church Pledge and all of our resources stronger. But again, as you get ready to leave this episode today, what step are you going to take? But that's it for today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. We'll see you again soon for a brand new episode. Again, don't miss those that are coming. But that's it for now. Until the next time, grace and peace.